Hey guys, so today what I'd like to do, or rather what I would like to attempt to do, is make a video about my experience growing up in a narcissistic family with narcissistic abuse and talk about my experience. Um, just kind of a general overview, my story. I guess the reason that I've wanted to do this is because it's been a kind of somewhat confusing and a very long journey for me. I'm 38 years old, and obviously, my recovery is still ongoing. Part of the reason why I want to do this is in part because I spent a large period of my life trying to figure out what the hell was going on. When you're dealing with narcissistic family, things are confusing, to say the least. Anyone here that's gone through anything approximating it can tell you that it's crazy making, and it's really difficult to sort of make any sort of informed guess as to what's happening when you're a child and you don't really know what's going on. So there's a lot of different topics that I want to touch on. Part of this is autobiographical. I'm going to talk about like my story, not the whole story, obviously. I'll give you the broad strokes. I'll spare you my entire life story. And then a little bit about sort of coping strategies that I engaged in when I was younger that maybe were to my detriment, just trying to sort of like survive the situation. Full disclosure here, I'm not going to offer a ton of caveats here. I'm only speaking from my experience. I'm kind of framing this as advice to my 18-year-old self. If this doesn't apply to your own situation, or, your situation was worse than mine, I'm sorry. I guess the only thing that I want to say is that, I'm not trying to do this as like the trauma Olympics to suggest that my situation was better or worse than anyone else's. I'm not trying to claim that. It seems like these days that one really positive aspect of the internet, if I can say this, is that there seems to be a hunger, or at least in so much as I can see in terms of algorithm, rewarding people that have the willingness to like share personal accounts in terms of just an unedited video of somebody just expressing their stories, and that it appears to be helpful for people. So that's part of my interest. The other is some sort of catharsis that maybe this might help someone younger than me. I don't know. Anyway, whatever. Enough of an intro. I'll get into it. So I grew up in Portland, Oregon, in a suburb of Portland, Oregon, sort of a upper middle class, what you might think of as like a rich area in Portland called Lake Oswego. I had an upper middle class upbringing. I had parents, they were both working professionals. My father and mother were developers. My dad had his own company. He's fairly successful, as much as, one can be. He wasn't exactly, he didn't manage his money well, but he certainly earned enough of it that, we had a comfortable life. We didn't ever, I always had food on the table. I had clothes, toys and all of that, in terms of what you might call an idealistic American dream upbringing. The other side of this, though, is that both my mother and father came from intense intergenerational trauma growing up. My mother's biological father was different than all of her siblings, and he kind of abandoned the family at some point early on. So her father that she was raised by was a narcissist. And he scapegoated her. We'll get into those terms in a minute for those of you that might not be familiar with them. A scapegoat is, well, I'll just get into it now. A family scapegoat is essentially the role in a family that the narcissist picks to attack and essentially blame everything that goes wrong on. There's other roles, obviously, but for the purposes of right now, I'll just focus on that. So my mother was the family scapegoat. She was the oldest and basically took a hand in raising all of her siblings. My father, by contrast, was the baby of the family. Much of my father's upbringing, I don't really know, because much of what he's told me is sort of distorted and kind of rooted in half-truths. What I do know is that both his mother and father were alcoholics, and that there's speculation that his sister was molested by his father. I do know that his biological mother, struggled with alcoholism growing up, and that there was a long line of alcoholics on my father's side of the family. Anyway, growing up, I had a sister. She's 4.5 years younger than me. And both my sister and I and my family in general were more or less estranged from my father's side of the family. We would see them occasionally. The vast majority of my upbringing, I spent time with my mother's side of the family. And on my mother's side of the family, of the surviving siblings, I'll get into this in a minute. My mother had an aunt, or two sisters, my aunt and my uncle, all of whom are younger than my mother. So my mother's side of the family was really torn apart by, we talk about intergenerational trauma. So her father was a narcissist. And of course, that's damaging for anyone here that has grown up with a narcissistic parent. He tortured my mother. He called her bunny. There was this sort of strange sexual context to a lot of, making her do household chores. He never, from my understanding, he never sexually abused her, but he was physically abusive to her and all of the other siblings, of course, but mostly to my mother. This went on for years until she left, family, went to college. My mother, for her part, she was born in 1947. So a lot of this stuff for her, she's a baby boomer. My mom's, in her mid 70s now. This is not something that you really talked about or acknowledged. There was no therapy at the time, really. And there was a very crude understanding of narcissism compared to the way that it is today. I mean, if I was to, weigh in on this, I would say that even by today's standards, we're not doing, we're just getting to the tip of the iceberg in terms of a real actual cultural understanding of what actual narcissism is. I think a lot of people are anecdotally familiar with the terms, but I digress. I'm kind of all over the place here. Please bear with me. So anyway, my mother, she grew up in a narcissistic family. The family was torn apart by the fact that my mother's youngest brother was named Mickey. And I never met him because he died. He was killed by a drunk driver, and he was killed. His girlfriend was killed, and it left my mother's sister, Lynn, the youngest daughter, with permanent mental brain damage. And she had to be taken care of for the rest of her life until she ended up taking her own life, throwing herself off of a 5-story apartment building. So a lot of intergenerational trauma going on with my mother's side. My father's side also, I just don't really know what it is because he's never really talked about it. What I do know, though, is that my father is a textbook sort of narcissist. He falls into a subtype of narcissism called easy moralizer. That is essentially to say someone who cannot see the world in terms of a spectrum of gray. Everything is either all black or white thinking. And because of that, they're essentially at war with humanity. Everyone is either all good or all bad. Things are very much fixed in their sort of categories. And that's kind of how my sister and I were raised. And like, you know, when you're a kid, you don't really know what's going on. You're sort of dependent on your parents to lend perspective and essentially to raise you. But when you're raised in a narcissistic family, you don't really receive any kind of parenting per se. My parents bought my sister and I things. You know, I was giving clothes and they paid for my orthodontia and, you know, I was given care in that way. So I'm not denying that, you know, I wasn't provided like, you know, like what I needed in terms of, you know, food and nutrition and things like that. My parents weren't neglectful in that way. Where there was neglect, though, was any kind of expression of emotion was that was not in immediate service of our parents was denounced. So I'd mentioned that my mother grew up with a narcissistic father. She also suffered from bipolar growing up, which was passed down to me as well. Most of my memories growing up are of my mom being bedridden, not ever getting out of bed, and just feeling depressed all the time. I was what's called parentified by her from a very early age. So from about the time I was 10 or 11 years old, as early as I can remember, she would vent her frustrations about her relationship with my father to me in a way that was brutally honest. She would speak to me like I was one of her girlfriends or male friends in a very adult and explicit manner. So telling me things about how we didn't have enough money or that, you know, we were going to lose the house or that my father was abusing her and about how, you know, he was hitting her and essentially, you know, just taking all of her stresses and worries and feelings of frustration and feelings of being trapped and then sharing that with me because she didn't have anyone else to talk to. This is apparently very common, something that I've learned about later on is common in a situation with narcissistic family abuse. And as a kid, you don't really know what to do. You don't understand that this is an unusual paradigm. I eventually came to learn somewhat early on that this is unusual behavior because of course I had friends and I would, you know, talk with them and, you know, compare census reality. And most of my friends didn't have parents that spoke about the intimate details of their, you know, intimate relationships or lack thereof with their, you know, partners. They didn't share stories about, my mother had been married 3 times prior to my father, and obviously that's somewhat unusual you know, stories to share with, you know, a child. So all that was really confusing for me. I didn't know what to make of it. So quickly, early on, though, because I didn't want my mother to feel bad and I was sensitive to her, I sort of became like her therapist. So I would vent to her about my frustrations with dad, my father, I should say. And she would tell me about hers. And this kind of became the way that we would bond together. Growing up in this way was a strange experience. The only reprieve that I had from the abuse, which I'll get to in a minute, was both my parents worked full time growing up. So when I was really young, I spent a lot of time growing up at my grandmother's house, and that was amazing. My grandmother, unfortunately, she recently passed away. For all of her faults, was in some ways a very saintly person. She was great. She ran a boarding house with students from all over the world, and it was kind of a magical experience. She had about an acre of property outside of Portland in a suburb called Multnomah, near Multnomah Village, for those of you that are familiar with Portland, Oregon. And growing up there was just like, it was magical. I loved being there. She had students from Japan and the Middle East and from Korea and China. And I loved spending time with the students. All of them were kind of like early, college students going to Portland State University at the time. And I loved talking with them and hanging out with them. They'd often like be cooking food from, like their native countries, and they would teach me how to count and speak certain words in Japanese and Chinese. And there was a guy that lived with my grandma who had like an actual, like a Famicom, not, like an NES Nintendo. And, he had like, the Japanese version of Nintendo. And it was really, really cool, like just to have that like cultural exchange when I was so young. And that was a really magical experience. So I loved it there. My closest and best friend lived right next door to my grandmother's house that I still know to this day. I don't remember meeting him. He's 2 years older than me. So that was fantastic. And then my other really close friend lived down the street. And so this is like, that having that as a reprieve from my parents' house is in some ways what saved me, in terms of like being in an environment that wasn't entirely narcissistic. And I can't say enough about how much I enjoyed growing up in that environment. More on that later. So growing up at my parents' house, my father had a violent temper. He ran his own business after he was let go from the business that he was working with before, because as a narcissist, it's really, really difficult to maintain any kind of interpersonal relationships. My dad was a covert narcissist around certain kinds of family friends, here I'm by no means like I don't have any credentials as far as psychology is concerned, or, and I'm not a medical doctor. And, so in terms of like my evaluation or my analysis, take this with a grain of salt. Obviously, this is my own dime store wisdom filtered through my own experience. But my dad, he shared traits with kind of an overt narcissist and also a covert narcissist. So covert narcissists, like, I'm not going to go into all of it, but essentially they try to hide around certain kinds of people and not reveal exactly who they are until that person is sort of aware of who they might be or their real identity. And overt narcissists usually, they're not so concerned with the opinions of others. They're just, they're happy to engage in whatever, selfish, self-interested action they want, as long as it's bringing them towards or closer to what they desire, which is generally narcissistic supply, which we'll get into in a minute. For the purposes of the rest of this discussion, I'm not going to try and explain these terms. I think this conversation is just better served for me to use these things interchangeably. If you're curious about what they are, surely you can do that research on your own. And there's a lot of great people I'll mention who are far better about explaining these things than me. So anyway, let me continue. So abuse in my house usually consisted of my father kind of ran the house like a tyrant, kind of like a dictator. He had a very unstable sense of self, and he was hypersensitive to any kind of what he perceived to be criticism of him or anything that he was doing, or anything that he disagreed with or he felt was a threat to this unstable sense of self. So an example of that, I'll just give some examples. My dad and I might be watching something on TV, which is one of the ways that we bonded, because my dad and I didn't really do anything else together. We didn't really have any father-son hobbies or anything. Occasionally we would go and see movies together, which were actually like some of the few like positive memories that I have with my father's. Like both my father and mother really were intense connoisseurs of like film and movies. And yeah, anyway. So an example might be we'd be watching something on TV together. In the case of this example, it was a television show called Prophet, involving a sociopathic television character, a sort of Patrick Bateman-esque kind of character. If any of you are familiar with Bret Easton Ellis's book American Psycho, as a frame of reference. Anyway, I remember I was like 11, 12, and I turned to my father and I was like, "Wow, this is a really good show, Dad." And he goes, "This isn't a good show. This show is sick. These people are sick. You think this is a good show? You're sick if you think this is a good show." And things like this would continue throughout my childhood. And the older I got, the more he would kind of gauge in this behavior where he would sort of talk to himself through me. And I became acutely aware of this probably even by the time I was about 10, 11, 12 years old. I became aware of the fact that he wasn't talking to me. It was like he was looking at himself through me, or seeing me as an extension of himself. I didn't have the language to articulate it in that way at that time, but I could feel it, if that makes any sense. So this happened a lot growing up as a kid. Things like looking at my childhood drawings and being like, here's another thing about narcissists my dad's also an alcoholic. So classic kind of inconsistent parenting. My parents were hyper strict about certain things and then completely lax about other things. And I'm sure anyone here that grew up in an environment like this can attest to the fact that you get wildly inconsistent parenting. So I'll just give a routine example. From the time I was probably 4 or 5 years old, selectively, I was allowed to see like certain rated R movies. It's no problem for my parents. Which I actually really, in retrospect, I appreciated. I don't think that it was appropriate for me to see the content. I'm not advocating for that on behalf of other parents or whatever. But because I grew up in an adult environment, it was really nice to see an adult world reflected in films, especially films involving kids my age, because it's like, oh, this just felt so much more true to life than kids' films where, the kids weren't being hit or yelled at, or, the adults were using this sort of cleaned up language, which was not my experience growing up. So anyway, I digress once again. So my father would, he'd see me drawing a picture, like as kids do. And these pictures that I was drawing, sort of reflected the content that I was consuming, which is, as a kid, we listen and we repeat. And that's something also that I was kind of aware of. It's just like, as a kid, I remember feeling like a robot around the time I was in first or second grade. I wouldn't use those words exactly, but I just remember feeling like I was just always like copying something that someone would say or do, or to try and impress them, or, and feeling really weird about it. So anyway, I liked to draw when I was a kid, and a lot of my drawings were sort of violent in nature. Like, so for example, let's say I'd watched the movie Terminator, and then, I would, draw or recreate scenes from the movie that were, often, somewhat violent and bloody. And, I didn't see it in that way as a kid. It didn't even register to me that, it was problematic. And I never had the desire to hurt another person or anything like that. Like, like for me, it was just kind of, like I could understand the difference between a fictitious sort of fantasy world and the world of reality in which people had feelings. But for my dad, there was no gray zone there. So he would look at my drawings and he would say things to me like, "This drawing is sick. You're a sick person and you need help." And I did. I was sent to therapists growing up. And a lot of these therapists that I saw as a kid were concerned for me because I also, in addition to what was going on at home with the abuse, screaming, yelling, things like hitting my mom. Both my parents would scream at one another constantly. I had severe learning disabilities. I'm sort of beginning to piece together some of why I might have learning disabilities. I had what I later understood to be math disability, or math dyslexia, excuse me. It's called dyscalculia. And in addition to dyscalculia, I had this severe balance issue. And all of this is like frontal lobe, kind of cerebellum related activity in terms of like things related to long-term planning, word and logic puzzles, and things like reading. I really struggled with. When I was a kid, just like a baby, basically. I was like 6 to 8 months old. I was on a countertop and my mom left me unoccupied for, I don't know, maybe a minute. But as anyone who's a parent here knows, when you leave a child unoccupied for a minute, things can happen. And I fell off the countertop and I landed on my face on a hardwood floor that was maybe like, 6 feet below the or 5 feet or whatever it was. It was a fairly high countertop. And I suffered a traumatic brain injury. I'm somewhat convinced that may have contributed to my balance and my issues with math. My mother's doctor at the time asked her if I was crying afterwards. And she said yes. And the doctor said, "Dad, don't worry, he's fine." And this was in 1985. So there was no brain scan or imaging or anything like that, like there is today. But anyway, another digression. So I saw a number of, therapists growing up, and things related to the fact that it was really, really hard for me to understand the concept of time, both literally and figuratively. I was very slow to understand. And when I was in first grade, I was extraordinarily far behind my peers in terms of being able to spell and write correctly. An example would be I'd be given an assignment and I would just write a bunch of random letters, and then, I'd be like, oh, okay, I'm done. I'm done with my assignment. And I kind of, I showed symptoms of being what we call like attention deficit. I personally believe that a lot of what I was going through was a response to the environment that I was in. But at the time, it was a very taboo subject, especially in a well-to-do suburban area, to, like the idea that there might be something going on at home, or maybe there's a problematic home environment. So none of that was ever explored. So I got put on Ritalin around the time I think I was maybe by 5th grade. So around the time I was about 11 years old, I was placed on Ritalin. And Ritalin did help with my academic performance, in combination with having like a really good teacher. I was lucky in that way. I had some really good teachers growing up. And that was kind of another one of those like, I don't know, we'll call it like serious, like, silver linings to my experience. They really helped me. And this teacher in particular, her name was Miss Maudsley. She kind of like wouldn't let me get away with the kind of thing that I would pull with every other teacher, which was, I'm dumb and I can't do this. She kind of held me accountable for my behavior, and I had her for 2 years. And by the time I was in 7th grade, I had caught up with my peers and was actually doing quite well. I was still behind in math, but in every other subject, I was like sort of on pace or, ahead of everyone. By no means like, I'm not saying that to suggest like I'm some sort of like Rhodes Scholar or anything, like far from it. I've always struggled with school, but I did well when I was in middle school. But I hated Ritalin. It made me feel totally depressed. And in addition to what was going on with the narcissistic abuse, I was also in the early stages kind of displaying the symptoms of bipolar. And because of that, and because of all this this combination of things, it created a lot of tension around trying to be what you might call like a normal functioning kid. I really struggled with things like anxiety and standard teenage things like trying to fit in, but coupled with the stress of like going home and dealing with a father who was physically, mentally, and psychologically abusive was really, really challenging. The other part of this that I'm going to get into, and this might be triggering for some people, so I'm going to offer this as a caveat before I say it. So in addition to the physical abuse that I suffered when I was a kid, my dad, like when I was 4.5 years old, I was holding my sister in a hot tub, and she was a like a newborn baby at that point. And I slipped on the bottom of the hot tub because it was slippery. Yeah, we had a hot tub. It was like from the 70s. And my sister went underwater for maybe like a second or two, and my dad grabbed her from me, set her to the side of the hot tub, and just backhanded me, like slapped me across the face, like so hard that one of my baby teeth got knocked out. And that was the first time that my dad ever hit me. And I'll never forget the amount of like shame, and like I felt so awful, like I felt worthless, and that's like sort of when I started like to hate myself. And when like that sort of like inner critic voice began to, start kind of chiming in my head that you're this bad object, that you're unworthy of love and affection. And, that sort of began to perpetuate around at that time. So this abuse continued, there was a lot of, my dad would do things to me like, I know I'm jumping around a lot. So, apologies for that. This subject matter, the way that I remember it is, I have, what's called, hyperphantasia. So basically, all of us have what, or actually all of us don't have. For those of us that can see things in our mind's eye, like pictures, when we remember things, I have a very kind of like it's kind of like that on steroids. So for those of you like that can imagine like a memory and see it, for me, I can get almost like completely and totally enveloped in a memory. And once I get into that spiral of thinking about those memories, it often kind of like it'll trigger other memories, and it kind of like starts spooling out like a projector reel. And so one memory leads to another memory. And anyway, that's kind of like, that's why I bring up that memory of me in the hot tub. And then further from that, thinking about like other incidents, my dad liked to like look at me like with these like very stern and sort of like intense eyes. I don't really know how to describe it. Just like where he's just like, it's like almost like a boiling pot, like just boiling over with rage. Usually I can tell that it's related to something. Even as a kid, I could tell that it was related to something that had nothing to do with me, but he would find a way to like channel it into me. This again ties into the concept of like a scapegoat. So he was fond of pulling me into rooms where no one else was around and sort of isolating me from my mother and my sister. And he would get very close to me and kind of like shake me and scream incredibly loudly. Both my father and mother were fond of screaming. They had extraordinarily loud voices. I mean like ear-piercing screaming. And when they got angry, these voices got even louder. I can only imagine neighbors probably heard this, because kids growing up, like a lot of kids were forbidden to come to my house growing up, and that was also a point of kind of stress and contention and like dealing with the situation as it existed. But my father would often shake me when he was angry or he was upset. A couple different incidents that I'll just bring to mind. Obviously, there's too many here to talk about, in one video, and this is already 40 minutes. So I don't want to, go on too much longer, for one video. But my dad, he would scream at me, and he would tell me basically about my future, and how he would say things like he had these pet sayings that he loved to say. So, for example, he would tell me that, in your future, like, someday your friends, you're a bullshitter and you're a liar, and someday all the people that you know and all the people that you're friends with will know that you're a liar, and they're all going to abandon you. Or he would tell me that, that people that you, excuse me, sorry. I'm losing my train of thought because, some of this is difficult subject matter, as I'm sure all of you can understand, that at least those of you who can understand. So I'm just going to talk about a different incident. Because again, mind flashing, this is the first time I've ever done this. This is the first time I've put myself on video, so bear with me. My father and I took a hunter safety course together under the pretense that we would go hunting. We never did, which is another really common thing in a family like this. The narcissist says they'll do something and then they don't do it. And it's almost like because they had the idea or the suggestion of doing it, it's just the same as having done it. So talking about doing something is by proxy doing it, and or in this case, preparation for doing something is the same as doing it. So we took this hunter safety course together, and that was actually something of a positive experience. There was trauma involved, of course. This is around the time I was about 12 or 13 years old. And near the end of the course, my dad, he decided one night that he wanted me to practice loading guns in the house. So we were in the kitchen, and my dad he's trying to explain to me how to load this 22, which is like a rifle. And I'm loading the rifle, and as he's giving me the instructions, he starts talking louder and louder and louder and louder and louder until it gets to the point where he's explaining to me how to do things. But as we're getting to the point where we're feeding live ammunition into these rifles, I'm 12 or 13. He's explaining it to me the first time. He starts screaming at me the instructions for like how to twist the bolt properly. And, saying things like, "You're loading a fucking gun. Don't you understand how dangerous this is?" And just absolutely flying off the handle. And I remember at the time, and many times growing up, I would disassociate from these experiences because it's just too psychically intense to process these kinds of things as a kid in a way that was, not like sort of earth-shatteringly, like character breaking. So my way of dealing with it, because my parents were so into movies and we rented so many movies as a kid, and I watched so much TV, and my form of disassociation was just to pretend that anytime that there was a lot of abuse, that it was just a movie and that I was just a character in a movie. And I would just kind of watch myself from a kind of third person perspective, experiencing these things, and just pretended that like I was like a character in a film and that it wasn't real. And a lot of that was kind of driven by my mother. She would say things to me like, "Your father's coming home and I need you to pretend to be happy. Just pretend to be happy. I know that you're not actually happy to see my father." And I wouldn't, because she would have been having just gotten, I'd get home from school and she would tell me about the horrible things that he had done to her at work. She'd be like, "Just pretend to be happy like a character in a movie. Like, just pretend like you're happy to see him. And, she'd be like, just smile and hug him because he'll be happy to see you. And that'll make him happy. And then everyone will be happy. So I became convinced very early on that I was kind of responsible not only for her happiness, but for my dad's happiness, for my family's happiness, and by extension, everyone's happiness all the time, everywhere. And I started to engage in a lot of people-pleasing behaviors, whether it be with my friends or, anyone around me. I just wanted everyone to feel at ease, and I would do whatever was necessary to put everyone at ease. And because of that, I developed a really poor sense of self. It was kind of really hard for me to discern where my personality began and other people's personalities kind of like ended, if that makes any sense. And like it kind of deeply affected every aspect of my being growing up. I was fortunate enough to have some really good friends growing up. I wasn't like a social outcast or anything like that. And I was able to become socialized, in part because what I would do was, because I didn't have any like real role models for parents, I would sort of take all the aspects of my friends' parents that I really liked and kind of mold them into a kind of Frankenstein idea of like an idealized parent. So I'd take little things from my uncle on my mom's side of the family, or I would take things from, my close friend's dad. And I would try to remember that as like a healthy model for behavior that I wanted to embody later on in life, because, my father was no role model. He often contradicted himself. He would say one thing and do another. He was grossly overweight my entire life, yet in spite of that, he would constantly chastise me for being lazy or fat. I was the scapegoated child. My sister would be enlisted in things like piano lessons and stuff like that. Whereas if I ever expressed a desire to do something similar, he would offer some strange caveat. Like, I remember at one point maybe expressing an interest in playing guitar because my dad played guitar and he had a guitar, and he's like, well, I don't know. Like, is this something you really want to do? Or is this just some passing fancy for you? Because we're going to pay for lessons and you don't like it. That's a huge waste of money. And using money as a means to control was another major tactic growing up. So, I was not at a loss for toys as a kid. My parents were very generous in that regard. But anytime they bought me anything, it was used as a means of like a kind of strange bargaining chip. So for example, like, my dad would say things like, got you that jacket for Christmas, special deal. He loved to say that. Special deal. Got you that jacket. Who bought you that jacket? I did. I bought you that jacket. Who bought you this computer? I did. I bought you this computer, and you're so ungrateful. You don't care about it at all. Stuff like that. That continued all through life. Yeah. Anyway, this has gone on for almost an hour. I'm not exactly sure if I'm going to post this at this point. I just kind of wanted to do this more as an exercise, mostly for myself. Kind of my own narcissistic Marcus Aurelius meditations on what it was like to grow up in a narcissistic family. I know this was completely scatterbrained and I jumped all over the place, and that I covered a lot of different material. I don't know if this is of use to anyone else. But, if this finds anyone else, I just wanted to close this video with a few things. If you grew up in an environment like this, and then maybe this will be the segue into a next video if I do ever post this. If you grew up in this environment, you're going to come out with scars mentally, sometimes physically and emotionally. There's a whole swath of subject matter that I didn't get into, involving my dad and adult material. My dad, that's a topic for another video. But yeah, I was abused in a lot of different ways. But anyway, that's not the point of what I'm trying to say. If you went through an experience akin to this, whether you had emotional abuse, you were physically abused or psychologically abused, or all of the, you're going to need help. And I know that things like therapy are cost prohibitively expensive. The thing that I would advise for you, if you're suffering from CTPSD, complex PTSD, disassociation, in my case, it manifests as maladaptive daydreaming, which you can look up. There's forums on that. Or narcissistic adjacent behavior, or what we'd call narcissistic fleas, which I have a lot of. Intimacy is a really hard thing for me. I actually just got out of a 7-year relationship, and a lot of what brought the end of that relationship is, number one, codependency, because you tend to get attracted to people you can recreate your childhood with, and typically that other person, if they have any unresolved issues, you get attracted to people like that. You're just kind of brought together like a tractor beam, like two magnets. Two abused people, you tend to seek each other out. And the only solution to this is self-work. It takes a lot of work on yourself. For me, I've come to realize this is a lifetime job. There are some things that have really helped me over the years. Some things that I wish I had done a lot more of. One of them is Vipassana meditation. I think any meditation practice is really good. I think Vipassana is especially beneficial just because of how deep you can go with it. It's definitely one of the more intense forms of meditation in terms of both the time commitment and learning the technique. But in North America, and also all over the world, but especially in North America, for anyone that's watching this in America, there are a lot of centers that are available. The technique is free to learn, actually. The process is by donation only. So if you're curious, maybe I'll put a link, but in case I forget, it's dharma.org. You can look up Vipassana and dharma.org. And like I said, it's free to learn. It's by donation only. So obviously, there is like a cost for them to teach you the technique and all of that, but that cost is absorbed by the person who went before you. So if you're a person that can't afford to go, or you don't feel like you can't afford to go, you can. Someone has paid the way so that you can go. There's typically a waiting list because, it's obviously, I think it's gotten a lot more popular in recent years. But it's definitely a resource that I highly recommend. A lot of the pain that you're suffering right now has to do with sensations or trauma that is stored in the body. And what Vipassana does is you're working within the body to alleviate a lot of that pain. I'm not going to explain any more than that. Maybe I'll do a longer video where I sort of give a deep dive or an analysis of that, but that's really beneficial. The second thing is, if you can't afford therapy, which I know a lot of you can't, it's cost prohibitively expensive. And I would also go as far as to say that a lot of therapy is kind of broken right now. Whether it's cognitive behavioral therapy or another kind of therapy. There are things like BetterHelp, and I'm not disparaging them. I'm not saying that they're not beneficial, but I have found that a lot of therapists, for example, are not well trained about narcissistic abuse. I've had therapists that have suggested things like, you should write your family a letter, or, you should, sit them down and really tell them how you feel. And this is just terrible advice. This is like horrendous advice. And I've had extraordinarily well-meaning therapists in the past, both student therapists and so-called professional therapists that, I would explain to them the living situation that I grew up in, and they were never able to come to a diagnosis of narcissistic abuse or even alcoholic abuse for that matter, that they just didn't really see it that way, or they didn't have the training to understand it to any degree of nuance that would help me or help someone else in that situation. So what I was going to suggest is there's a couple books that I was going to recommend. One of them, hold on here, I'm going to load up my list. You bear with me for one moment. So first and foremost, why I'm waiting for this list to load, is The Narcissist in Your Life by Julie L. Hall. There's a number of books on narcissism. This happens to be one that I've read that I got a lot out of. So The Narcissist in Your Life is it's a really great deep dive kind of overview into just the sort of broad strokes of what you went through, how different roles get assigned in a narcissistic family, and what you can do to sort of reclaim your life and sort of, get out of that, or attempt to break out of the kind of tractor beam pull that it has on you in terms of the debilitating effects and so on and so forth. The other thing that I was going to recommend is it's a book called, let's see here, CPSD, Complex PTSD, Surviving to Thriving. So this is a book by Pete Walker, and I'm not actually done with it yet, but I highly recommend it. Complex PTSD is something that a lot of people that have had narcissistic abuse are suffering from. In fact, almost anyone I know that grew up in a violent narcissistic family or even a violent alcoholic family is suffering from some form of complex PTSD. Some might be more than others. Again, this isn't the trauma Olympics. If you've suffered abuse, you've suffered abuse. And you're storing that abuse in your body and in the form of what are called flashbacks, emotional flashbacks. And these can be debilitating. And I know that they are for me. They've caused me tremendous social anxiety over the years. And they cause me to engage in a lot of self-soothing kind of behavior with things like alcohol, things like pornography. I suffer for things like, I don't want this to get canceled, so I'll just use the word adult behavior addiction. That's, really problematic for me. A whole host of things that I've done to try and grapple with and get over this. What I was going to say is, so that's a book that I highly recommend. In addition to reading material, there's some YouTube channels that I seriously recommend for people that, can't afford therapy. There's a YouTuber, he goes by Richard Grannon. He runs a YouTube channel called Spartan Life Coach, which I think is highly beneficial. There's also, there's a guy, he self-identifies as a narcissist. So take this with a grain of salt, but his content is actually quite good. His name is Sam Velkin, I think. Let's see if I can pronounce this. I just want to make sure that I'm getting this right. Sorry, I apologize. I should have had this laid out before. Vaknin, excuse me, Sam Vaknin. So Sam Vaknin is, he lays out a lot of really, really good material. There's also a couple of really good female practitioners on YouTube that I wanted to recommend. Dr. Romney is really great. She runs a YouTube channel. There's also a woman, she runs a channel called The Crappy Childhood Theory. Some of her content is good, so make use of those resources and educate yourself on this subject as best you can. The next step that I would advocate for anyone who's suffered from any of this is engaging in self-interested action. So what do I mean by engaging in self-interested action? I mean, so your diet is incredibly important. Recently, I started a keto diet. I've been doing it for a little over a month. Before keto, I had a severe addiction to sugar and carbohydrates. That was one of the things I would use to cope, was food. Fortunately for me, I've never really struggled with my weight too badly. But I definitely had problems with sugar, especially sugary cravings at night. And keto diet really helped with that. Also with things like mood and concentration, which is something that is really difficult for me. In addition to diet, I would say that having a movement or an exercise practice is essential. So for me, I love swimming laps, which is ironic because I haven't really been able to do it for a year. It's a very long story why that is. Some of it is an excuse. Another part of it is that I've been living abroad for the last 10 years, and only very recently did I get back. I thought I was going to be able to cover all that in one video, but clearly there's a lot to discuss here. So anyway, have a movement practice, have an exercise practice. I don't care if it's up to you, whether that's weightlifting or jogging or even walking to start is really beneficial. I find that it will help you get out of your head and get into your body. Whatever you can do to engage in that, it's so important. It's just so essential. So often I fall into, despair, and a lot of it is because I'm just not taking care of myself physically. The way forward with a lot of this is, number one, educating yourself, not necessarily in any kind of logical order, but number one, educating yourself. Number two, diet and nutrition. And then number three, self-interested action as far as your body is concerned. Take care of your body. That represents a kind of triangle. Below that, things like work and hobbies and having a work-life balance if possible. I know it's not possible for some of you. It's something that I also struggle with in my own life. I I think that's more than enough for now. So for those of you that, made it this far, thank you for listening to my story. Again, I'm not sure if this is useful or not useful, but I'm 38 years old, and, as I approach middle age, I realize that it going through this stuff is, it's just really, it sucks. It's really shitty. There's just no way around it, and I would love to tell you that, you eventually you move out and you just get over this stuff, but actually it's the opposite. The more you put off dealing with it, in some ways the harder it gets. And certain things do get easier, but they have to be acknowledged. It's kind of like sorting through garbage rather than just taking, your baggage of the past and shoving it in a crawl space in your psyche and just assuming that it's going to get sorted out. I thought that I had all this shit under wraps in my mid-20s when I stopped therapy around 26. And it wasn't until about 10 years later that I realized that I had only addressed the weeds. I had mowed the grass, and that jungle had grown back, far more dense than I possibly could have imagined once I was willing to, open that door of my mind again. Anyway, that's it for now. Thank you for listening.